Well, thank you, Jonathan, and good evening to everyone who is in Kilimati. I apologize that I can't be with you because I'm recovering from a bout of shingles, and I don't want to be transmitting it to anybody whose immune system is not where it should be. Um, it's great to see that we still retain a lot of our overseas members, and I wish to, on behalf of the society, welcome each and every one of you because um, we're here to provide a service for people about the history of Kilishal and Clonanese, and it's important that we keep in contact with your good selves because I know from my own experience and talking to other people, the pull of the the old sod, as they call it here, is quite strong, and people do feel connected, and this is as good a way as any to keep that connection going. Um, I'd like to welcome particularly tonight Simon and Patsy Porter. Patsy is a member of the Burgess family, and he was actually born in Parkanaur, and well, shall we say, a few years ago. It's nice that they are joining us because it gives us a connection to what the subject of the talk is tonight. Also, as Jonathan mentioned there, it's good to see Canadian, American, I'm not sure if we have any Australian members.
No, not sure, but there could
No,
be.
no, not to worry. And there's just one thing I'd like to say before I let you go, Jonathan, and get going, is we have a talk next month by Dr. Russell Rees, who was a history lecturer in Omagh Academy. The subject of the talk will be 1922, Conflict in the South, Partition in the North is the title of the talk. And it's a very illuminating talk in that we're 100 years past that, and it would be remiss as a historical society to not mark that somehow, that momentous year in the history of this part of the world. So thank you for that. It will be on Tuesday, the 25th of October at 8 p.m. in Kilimati. And I would urge as many members as possible to attend, whether it be via this medium or in person. And hopefully we'll see you all in October. Thank you, Jonathan. Jonathan is well known to members here as a brilliant researcher and someone whose heart and soul is in the interest of the society. And I know that Parkanaur is one of his favorite subjects. So I'll let you loose now, Jonathan. Off you go. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Brendan. Thank you. Tonight's talk is entitled A History of Parkanaur. What I hope to do tonight is, obviously Parkanaur, to those of us who live locally, you know, it's the big house, and many of the families that live locally here would know the Burgess family about it. But I've tried to cover in the next hour or so as much about the history of the place. Obviously, we'll be talking about the history of the family itself in the last 200 odd years. But there'll be a couple of little steps aside, and we'll look at things that were going on in the wider world at the time and how that impacted locally. And there hopefully will be a few wee surprises along the way that you might not have been expecting. So this introductory slide here is a picture of Parkanaur, probably taken about, I don't know, 1905. And I'll actually have a bit of a close-up on the couple that are at the top of the steps a bit later on in the talk. So this next slide is a quotation from an article by a man called Lindsay Proudfoot, a Queen's University lecturer. And it was taken from the memoirs or journal, log, diary, call it what you like, of John Einar Burgess from August 1868. And I thought it was quite good at sort of setting the tone of Burgess family and the place that was their home for the best part of 2 centuries. So Parkanaur is one of the few realities of gratitude in this life. It always welcomes me with pleasure each time I return there. I love it more and more. I look upon it as my firstborn that has riveted my love so strong, so fast, that it can never be shaken. So quite a powerful sentiment that he recorded at that time. And this is actually the words of Lindsay Proudfoot from an article that he published in 2000. It's, if you can ever, you can look, you can get it online. It doesn't cost anything. You just do a Google search for it. It's a very powerful academic examination of Parkanaur as a place, of the family in that place, and its wider context within Irish history and society over the time period that it was there. So Lindsay says this: the narrative of place and identity of Parkanaur provides ample evidence of the ambiguity of both the social discourse between landlords and their tenants in 19th century Ireland and the negotiation of elite identities there. On this evidence and in this place, a straightforward colonial reading which stresses exclusively ethnic difference and cultural inferiority cannot be sustained. Throughout the period, the relationship between the Burgess family and their tenants was negotiated primarily in social and economic terms, which recognised either implicitly or explicitly their mutual interests. The social and economic space thus created was shared, and although it might occasionally be renegotiated in the landlord's favour and be occasionally charged with a sense of religious difference, no particularly negative means were attached to this. Now, obviously, Lindsay's talking in a very academic language, and I have to admit to reading that about 10 times before I get. But my interpretation of what he's trying to say is that the family were certainly not absentee landlords. They lived there, but it was more than that. It was home. There was very much a powerful association for the family to that as their home, as it was, as it functioned as a commercial entity. It had to pay its way. If it didn't, the family would be broke, plain and simple. And they wouldn't be the only landlords that went broke over a 200-year period in Ireland. A lot more than you probably realise. But what he's saying here is that, and we have over 3,000 articles that were deposited by the family before they left Parkanaur with the Public Record Office, which gives us a very complete history of the family's time. And there were no serious incidents with regard to a serious threat to the house itself or to the family. Now, it wasn't that there were none, but compared to some other things, and particularly the time period that Brendan was alluding to for the next talk in the early 20s, things seemed to get along fairly well. There was an understanding that as a landlord, he had to make the thing pay its way, but he wouldn't go out of his way to be gratuitously nasty as a landlord. In fact, he seemed to be the complete opposite. So we'll be examining some of those things as we go along, actually. So beginnings. So where does it all begin? Well, I'm concentrating on the townland of Eden Crannan tonight because that's where Parkanaur House sits today. Okay, this is the Bodley map of 1609. This is known as the Escheated Lands map, and this was the basis on which the land grants were given to servitors who had served in the army against Hugh O'Neill, or these would be English or Scottish landed families, aristocracy, whatever, who would receive these grants during the plantation in 1610. Eden Crannan is shown here. The spellings come out of the fact that the surveyors were generally English and they were trying to understand what was the native tongue, which was purely Irish. And they would spell things very often phonetically based on how they were hearing it. And funny, it's amazing how many of the townlands are perfectly recognizable from what they would have heard spoken to them whenever they were doing the surveys. With regard to its Irish origin, the interpretation from the Place Names NI website and the team of Kay Muir, which has been really good at researching a lot of these things over the last 20 or 30 years. So probably in a Crannan brow of the wooden vessel. It's hard to know whether that's accurate or not, but with an interpretation of the nearest in terms of the Irish origins of that, that's what we would think that it probably refers to. Irish townland names are generally descriptive, something to do with the topography, sometimes to do with the people that lived there, or events or actions that took place on them. So a timeline from the earliest of times, if you like, up to 1771 for Eden Crannan. So before 1609, and obviously the defeat of Hugh O'Neill, the flight of the Earls, it was part of the territory of the O'Donnellys of Tyrone. The O'Donnellys were a support family to the O'Neill ship of Tyrone, and their role was as marshals, which was, for want of a better word, generals to his forces, and they were also the fosterers to his children. That is an ancient structure that existed in Ireland for centuries, if not millennia, where you would have a kingship family at the head, which was the O'Neills, and then you had these supporting families with various roles in administering the territory that the O'Neills commanded over. And the O'Donnellys had come down from the northwest of Ireland with them many centuries before, and they had retained this connection right to the end. So plantation, the particular townland, Eden Crannan, was part of a grant to Captain Sir Toby Caulfield, who later was knighted, became Sir Toby Caulfield. His claim to fame was he commanded the Blackwater Fort around the time of the defeat of Hugh O'Neill in 1602. So I think he was also at Kinsale as well. He died without marrying, no children, in 1627. And his land and title passed to his nephew, also called Toby. In 1642, after the rebellion broke out in 1641, that Toby Caulfield was murdered just down the road. The estate then passed into the hands of his brother, William Caulfield, who became the first Viscount Charlemont. In 1666, we had a taxation known as the hearth money rules. Anybody that had a substantive dwelling, not usually what would have been called a wattle and daub cabin, but something probably made with stone that had a hearth, a proper fireplace with a chimney, they could be taxed, and they could be taxed for the number of hearths that were in the individual property itself. So sometimes it was one, sometimes it was two, and if you were very well off, there might have been three or even four. But in this case, we have hearths that are identified with the names Turlough MacGurk and Phelan O'Donnelly. So no surprise to see an O'Donnelly name in Eden Crannan in 1666. 1671, Major General William Caulfield, the second Viscount, son of the previous William Caulfield, he takes on the estate and lands, and then he is survived by 1726, his son James Caulfield, the third Viscount, and then finally we end up with 1734, James Caulfield, the fourth Viscount, son of the above, and who would become the Earl of Charlemont. Very famous character in Irish history, James Caulfield. So James Caulfield was still alive in 1771 when Eden Crannan was part of a batch of 5 townlands that were sold off as a job lot to this man, Einar Burgess. Now, rather wonderfully, thanks to the family's archives, we have this map survived in the papers in the Public Record Office in Belfast. So it dates from 1750. And it's quite easy to identify the outline of Eden Crannan townland with what we know today. It's a fairly accurately drawn map. It's not hard to work out where everything is if you look at a modern map of the townland today. We can clearly see there's a road going straight through the middle of it, and we'll come to that fairly shortly. And we can see 2 minor laneways or roads branching off to the north and to the south. We can make out the names of the tenancies because that's what this is. It's a tenancy map. So to the east, we have Johnson and Mala, John Wilson. Over west of that, we have Harvey and Quinn. To the south, this brown area is the Great Crannon Bog, all 26 acres of it, 20 feet deep in places at its height, was nearly entirely robbed out by local people over a period of a century and a half for fuel. You can just about make out the remnants of part of that bank that's still around 12 to 14 feet high or deep in the plantation within Parkanaur today. So other names that are in there, McGartlany or Gartlany, that's the name McGartland or Gartland as it would be known today. So they were known as the Gartlanys or the McGartlanys back then. Quinn, again, local name, that's going back to the, and then Camo. And we can see that the road extended west to Tullyallen. And that's actually where the town land boundary is the river, and then that would be Tullyallen Bridge, obviously. So what we have here now is the tenancy details that accompany that map you've just seen, except that we have the original tenants of 1750, and then we've observations in this middle section that date from 1799. And it records the acreage that each of those, so there we have James Campbell, 27 acres, Francis Millsap, 19 acres, William Brown, 12 acres, John Wilson, 15, and so forth and so forth. Gartley and Quinn, 55 acres. They accounted for most of that western half of, and along with Edmund Harvey and Quinn, another 33. So between those two tenancies, there were 88 acres in total in those sections. And then these are sublets that appear then on the right-hand side and the final columns, and obviously what they're paying in terms of rent. And I mean, it might look like, you know, I mean, for instance, James Campbell for his 27 acres in 1750, it was charged at £7, 3 shillings and 9pence. But you do have to bear in mind that is that's 270 years ago. So yeah, it's a bit dearer now. So this coat of arms, the big clue is at the top. So this is the Honourable East India Company. But anybody who knows their history would probably say the first part of that title stretching it a bit. But it was what it was for the times. But that's the coat of arms of the East India Company. You're probably thinking to yourself, what's that got to do with Parkanaur? But I'm about to explain why. So this, I said to you there that Einar Burgess purchased these 5 townlands in 1771 from the Caulfield family. Well, this is the explanation as to why. So first of all, his daughter Margaret had married a friend and colleague of his, Captain John Smith, who became a director, was probably a sea captain for the company originally, and had a long and illustrious career with the East India Company, and then became a director. Einar Burgess was the paymaster or paymaster general for the sea captains of the company. So a very elevated position within the East India Company, which obviously would have been quite lucrative for him as an individual and on a personal level. So again, as would be typical of this time, the marriages tend to have a connection commercially or whatever. It's within a close societal group. So no surprises then that he probably more or less arranged this, for want of a better expression. So as with any marriage at that time, and particularly at that level in society, a dowry or, a marriage settlement from the bride's side is usually part of that. So Einar had consulted his brother John, who lived at Wood Park in Armagh. The Burgess family, by the way, had a connection in Ireland going back to the 1600s. Mainly through Dublin and then up into Armagh. So he had consulted with John, who had an estate at Wood Park in Armagh, and John had said to him, look, land is far too expensive in England. It's going to cost you an arm and a leg to come up with some sort of a package in England as a dowry. Why don't you buy land here in Ireland? It's much more affordable. So he says, right, John, you go. And now he knew that at that particular time, a certain man called James Caulfield was offloading family land at a rate of knots. I'm not sure if it was to do with the building of Marino, but there has been various allegations made over the time that one of the reasons why James Caulfield sold a lot of the original 26,000 acres that had been amassed by 1627 was to pay for various projects, and one of them was the wonderful building of Marino in North Dublin. But anyhow, John comes up with this solution that he negotiated with James Caulfield for 5 town lands in Tyrone, which are mentioned up there: Tirrenew, Parkanaur, Edencran, Tullyallen, Killymoy, for £13,500. Now that is a preposterously large sum of money for 1771. I mean, that would be millions today. But anyway, John came back to him with this. He says, "Yep, that's good enough for me. Go on ahead with that." So it was presented as part of the marriage settlement, if you like. However, what transpired was that John hated it. And by the way, part of the settlement was that Captain John Smith became known as Captain John Smith Burgess, because there were no male heirs on Einer's side. Again, this was quite normally part of the settlement, that his son-in-law would take the family name as part of the succession in terms of a will or whatever. So John visited Parkanaur, or the lands that made up Parkanaur, and took an instant dislike to it. No, it's not for me. But Margaret had no intention of leaving a very comfortable, entertaining society in London that she had been brought up in, and was very much part of that, to be dragged away to cold, windswept, the sun only comes out 3 days in a year sort of thing. So it was an abysmal failure in terms of a wedding gift. It just never happened. So that left poor Einar with a problem. So the problem was well and truly bounced back into the court of his poor brother John at Wood Park, and arrangements were made, I think, with regard to renting or mortgaging the 5 town lands. I mean, they didn't try to sell it back to James Caulfield or whatever. I think John's attitude probably was, "Oh, I could have done without this. It's hard enough trying to make Wood Park work." I think John probably had an idea that the 5 town lands were very heavily neglected by the Caulfields. The Caulfields didn't need to worry too much about, how could I say it, very tight management with a lot of the land. There was so much of it. There was always an income. So they probably concentrated on the bits that mattered most, and probably tended to let others. There were stories that the rent hadn't been lifted in the 5 town lands for years. So John very quickly found this out as he took on a management role of the 5 town lands. So we roll forward a few years, and we've got a tenancy map for 1774 for Edencran. The names pretty much have not changed. We've got Benjamin Malla, John Johnson, John Wilson, Lawrence Quinn, Edmund Harvey, Turf Boggs, the Laird, the Gardlenese, and James Campbell. So not really no great changes there. You can still see the road running through the townland from east to west. This is an excerpt from the Taylor and Skinner Road Atlas of Ireland from 1778. And we can see Castle Caulfield down here at the bottom, and it actually shows the castle, or what would have been the ruins of it at the time. You can see the way the houses have been shown on either side of the street, for want of a better word, Castle Caulfield. And then the other thing is the church. It's St. Michael's Church, which was built in 1681-82. The road layout is obviously not the same as today. We can see some places we can identify. It shows a road leading north, or more or less. By the way, the angle of this is not true north-south, but you can see Altmore Road, Altmore. Tullyallen is mentioned. No mention of Parkanaur, because there wasn't anything built in 1778. But it just gives you a wee bit of a context. By the way, the blue area just above Castle Caulfield is Loch Ochlich, which is still there, just up Frenchman's Lane. So John Burgess died in 1790, and his son John Henry took over responsibility for Parkanaur and what would have been Wood Park as well. He married Marianne Johnston, and that's the Johnston family of Guildford. So this is miniatures, I think, of John Henry, probably in relatively later life, probably in his 40s, maybe something like that. And this is the coat of arms of the two families. Actually, the coat of arms on the left-hand side for Burgess is the Burgess coat of arms after the marriage to Marianne Johnston. If you look, the saltire, as it's known, is already included in the blazon of the, so this is again typical, it's a recognition of the elevated status of the Johnson family. So with the marriage, the Johnson emblems are added into the coat of arms of the Burgess family. Again, this is all typical of what has happened with heraldry over the years. So John realised that, you know, before he died in 1790, that if Parkanaur as an estate grouping was going to work, there had to be investment in it. There was no hedgerows. That's the first thing I need to tell you. You're talking about a wide open field landscape. The only vegetation would have been either what was planted by local farmers, barley, whatever, and crops in those way, but not a kind of a field system as we understand today. In terms of a lot of indigenous woodland, long gone. Wars in Ireland had wiped out most of our indigenous woodland in large swathes. So there had to be enormous levels of planting of both hawthorns for hedges to retain cattle, basically to retain good behaviour, because there'd be less falling out amongst tenants and boundaries if you could proper hedgerows. So one of the things that was planted in 1792 was the Crannon Grove in Eton Crannon, which is still there today. I mean, it's a pale shadow of its former self. It would have been a wonderful ring of oak trees or whatever, or beech, but a lot of them have been wiped out by storms over the last 200 odd years. Now, this is a wonderful map. Again, it's a tenancy map with no names on it, but what it does have is houses. Now, these houses are not just drawn in decoratively. They are to reflect an actual property that was there in that part of the townland in 1795. And what has survived alongside that is the comments of John Einar Burgess, who we'll come to shortly, from about the 1840s. And these are his recollections as a young man. And he records a lot about local people and the traditions and things and stories he was brought up with. So against this map, we can place some of his comments and work out who he's talking about and where from the arrows that have put in. So starting off in the bottom right, several small cabins occupy the ground on the south side, just in front of the present lawn. So if you're in Parkanaur today and you're looking down the hill towards the walled garden, that's the front lawn. That's always been the front lawn, okay? So he's looking down there with these cabins. That's just a collection of very basic houses. By the large sycamore. Now, that large sycamore that's there today, you have to press yourself in at the outside wall of the walled garden between it and the deer park. You can get in there, but there's a large sycamore tree about 60 to 70 feet tall in there. That's a picture of it. It's an American sycamore, Platanus occidentalis. That was planted in 1820. So it's 202 years old. We can name the year that it was planted. So anyway, by the large sycamore stood the Carman's Inn of old Mrs. Wilson. So it was an inn. And you're saying, so what's an inn doing in the middle of Eton Crannon? Well, it's there because what's going past it is the main road west from Dungannon to anywhere. That's the main road. It's not a lane. It's not a farm track through a few fields. It's the main road. So Mrs. Wilson, the largest woman I ever saw. He doesn't hold back on comments, John Einar. He's great entertainment. She had crowds of carmen and travellers stopping with her every night. It's a main road. No surprises there. She had a prime spot for an inn on the main road. She had the best of fare and made the best of cakes. So it obviously sampled them himself. So further on down the road, so where we are looking here is the lane or the road that goes through the deer park today. So we're heading now to more or less the gates of the deer park. around about that place. Further on lived Tommy Quinn, who died when past 100 years of age. He wore a small wig, what you see in old portraits. And bear in mind, this is comments in 1840, so we're talking a long time back. And remembered calling upon Lord Charlemont's agent at the old castle, where there was then a room left habitable and ready to receive tenants. So that's very actually important piece of historical information from that comment. Further on down the lane and further still lived Dan Devlin, the father of Jimmy Devlin, a man most learned in his way. He brought up a fine family. On giving up his land to me, he went to Killymoyle and died there. Okay. Next house on down, next to Devlin lived old Sarah Quinn, a fine old woman who had a child when 60 and died at 100. So it certainly had no negative effects on her health or outlook. Next house on down the road, up the road lived Stephen McLean and Alec McLean, both excellent men. Thriving plantations now cover their homely cottages. Stephen McLean, by the way, had one leg. Probably it could have been a farming accident, or he could have served in the army at some point. His other claim to fame was, those of you who've heard of the Tullyallen fight of 1824. Well, some of the people that were involved in trying to stop that actually turning into a fight, one was Crossley. The other was Stephen McLean, who was an Orange man. And he was allegedly, according to Burgess, the one who was solely responsible for turning the Orange men around with one leg. So he obviously held a certain amount of kudos and clout, but he lived there. And then finally on down to Cotton's Corner, which is there today, when you go in past Crannon Inn. At the crossroads lived Jack Cotton, the brother of the doctor. That's Dr. Cotton. He was an excellent fellow, the unfailing companion of Billy Doherty. They were both employed in making and repairing roads and never separate. All are gone now. When he's saying all are gone now, he's referring to all those people. So those were recollections from childhood by John Einer. Crannon Bog shown again, Crannon Grove, obviously Tullyallen Bridge is there. In here, this little rectangle, I've said proposed site of the Burgess property. This predates the building of anything by the Burgess family. So this is a hand sketched on addition to this map many, many years later, 20, well, maybe not 10 years, maybe later on. So focusing in a wee bit closer, a few years later, 1799, this is part of the rent roll books for the Parkanaur estate. So this is looking at the eastern half of Eden Crannon, and we can see here, there's the little row of houses, property of John Wilson. Again, there's some sketching in, mentions of a garden. So this is John Henry Burgess thinking about, right, we need to have a property here and manage the land locally, manage the tenancies locally. But nothing has been built yet. This is the beginnings of thinking about that. This is the actual tenancies in that section of Eden Crannon. So Benjamin Malla, Thomas White, Alex Murdoch, Benjamin Malla again. Now, interestingly, for plots 6 and 7, we see the name Parkanaur. So this is the beginnings of the Burgess family specifically acquiring part of Eden Crannon to build Parkanaur, or what would precede it. Parkanaur, by the way, taken literally from the Irish, would sort of suggest field of gold. Now, there's no explanation in any records I found anywhere that says where that came up with. The property that was initially built was called Eden Hall, Eden Field, or Eden Farm. It wasn't called Parkanaur. So that evolved fairly quickly within a few years. But we don't know specifically where it came from. There's nothing in any of the diaries says, I came up with the name Parkanaur because. Now, I had always thought that it might have been a reflection. These were bare hills at the start, but they probably did grow crops on them. If they grew barley on it, well, obviously, coming up to harvest time, that would look, and the Field of Gold song that's world famous is about, fields of barley. It's actually one of the lines in the song. But there's another possibility, and Pat, I don't know if you want me to let this out of the bag tonight. I'm getting your permission. Pat O'Neill, who has an enormous amount of local knowledge, Pat has a sneaking suspicion it might actually be more literal than just the colour gold. That there is certainly geology that would reflect the availability of gold in and around the river that meanders, because the river meanders, and where rivers meander, if you know your gold rush stories, you'll have seen the boys out panning at these meanders because it slows the current down, and it's enough to start to deposit silt and alluvial deposits and stuff like that there. So that is, to be honest with you, is as good an explanation as anything that's out there, because we do know that the geology supports that. And it may have been known to local people. The Burgess family picked up on this and maybe put it in there. It's hard to know. So you can actually see on this particular tenancy map from around 1804 that it's being called Eden Hall there, right-hand side. So this is the midsection, I think, of Eden Crannan. And again, you can see the houses are showing, and there are actually trees being planted along this road. Those are the same trees that are there today. Those beech trees were planted in the late 1790s, so they're whatever, 230 years old. Now, this is a wonderful, these are two sketches that were done by, would have been John Henry Burgess. In the top one, he is looking from probably somewhere around Tullyalan Grove eastwards in the direction of Parkanaur, and in the middle is the rise of Eden Crannan, where the house is today. That is the landscape that he looked upon in 1796. Completely bare. Very little in the way of natural woodland or anything. This is how it appeared in 1804. And what he's trying to indicate there is the planting of saplings, particularly along the crest and the ridge of Parkanaur. What was thought to be a tower on Eden Crannan between 1796 and 1804, I actually believe is the gable end of the first structure built, and I'll show you that in a second. So you sort of think that's a tower, and there are certain clues that don't fit right. There's a very hefty basement to the original property, which kind of almost looks Norman. It's that ridiculously overbuilt. I don't know how thick the walls are in the basement, but that had sort of made a suggestion that there was something much, much older. But as you can clearly see from the sketch of 1796, it's completely bare. This is another conjectural sketch looking way into the future at a much grander build that didn't actually happen in this way. This is probably more over sort of Killymoy looking towards Parkanaur rather than the views we'd looked at before. So this is what was originally built. It's what would be referred to as a cottage style build, 1802 to 1804. So if you take all the rest of Parkanaur away, you're left with the front entrance, except that originally it was over to the side. You can still see the bell, the pull cord in the wall, the gap. So the door was to the left, and then where the door is now today. So it was a three-gable building with a basement. So this would have been short-term stay for the Burgess family, really to discuss tenancies, grievances with tenants, whatever, and for a full-time agent to collect rent. There was nothing there previously. Moving to 1807, and we can see again on this eastern side of Eden Crannan, we can see the beginnings being sketched in, and notes on the left-hand side of how this development of what we would come to know as Parkanaur and the house today are forming out of the existing tenancies and who's still living there and whatnot. You can see that the collection of houses is still there in 1807, down in the bottom of the map. Now, the humdrum of the development of the estate, this is actually a receipt for £12, shilling and a halfpenny. And it is for 1,000 oak saplings, 1,000 Dutch alder, 100 mountain ash, 50 Huntingdon willow. I'm not sure that, 1,000 Scotch fir seedlings, 3,000, can't make that out, ash seedlings, 600 Scotch fir, 7,000 thorn quicks. So that's hedging. That's hawthorns. And there's a couple of other things there it mentions about the back. So that's the bill. Robert Nielsen, £12 for all that. And to give you an idea of the scale of how much was being invested to turn that barren sort of hillsides, it just goes on. And this is a brief look at the tenancies in 1817 in relation to the leases that date back to 1750, renewed again in 1790. Still the same names, Wilson, Gartlany, Quinn, they're all still there. This is another sketch that John Henry Burgess made, imagining, so you can see the 3-bay house that he's imagining adding on to the side, because there might not be the money to do it in one go. So he's imagining I'll do that then, and then I'll do this and I'll do that, which is very much how Parkanaur developed. So the planting. So this is a summary of planting up to 1820. So they planted the Eden, Crannan and Tullyallen ring forts in 1792. By 1800, he planted 27,000 trees and 91,000 hawthorn saplings, quicks as they were known. By 1813, he had planted 14 miles of hedges in the 5 townlands. Bad weather and famine in 18 and 14 and 15, most of the hedges were lost as fuel to the families, because with bad weather, you can't rely on turf. It's too wet, won't dry. So they had to burn something. So the 14 miles of hedges disappeared in 1 year. That gives you an idea of the scale of the population that lived here locally to try and keep themselves warm, that the whole hedgerow basically went in one winter. By 1819, he had replanted 158,000 trees, 318,500 hawthorn quicks at £1,012. So it's just the scale of what he's having to do. This is from John Einer's diary, and it's referring to the year 1820. My father, mother, brother and Anne Johnston arrived at Parkanaur on August 23rd, 1820. A grand fete was given for the tenants. Colonel and Mrs. Charity arrived on the 31st and left Ireland early in October, when I returned to Oxford. Parkanaur Hill produced an excellent crop of yellow legs potatoes. Still to this day, I've never heard anybody else mention that particular variety of potato, and I would love to know more about it. But anyway, Parkanaur House was commenced by my father this year. So this is the development of this 3-bay building that had been there for 16, 17, 18 years into something a wee bit grander. So this would become a permanent home, not a temporary stay place. Old John Cooper was the head mason. That's a wonderful piece of information. So we know who was in charge of any of the major builds. And Joseph Wilson was head carpenter. The first stone was laid in September of 1820. I planted several trees in 1820, viz. The cedar opposite the house, the variegated sycamore I mentioned to you down by the wall, on the outside of the wall garden, and the weeping ashes. The greater part of Parkanaur was planted this year, also the small oak plantation at the foot of the garden. My poor father was taken ill this year at Parkanaur, went off to Dungannon, where he was obliged to remain, where my mother joined him. Afterwards, he went to Armagh to be near surgeons, and in June returned to Parkanaur. My mother commenced the garden, now Pinetum, this summer. So that's down more into the plantation as we sort of know it today. Now, this is again a lovely survival in the family's archives. This is the labour account for the year 1829 to 1830. So we have the names of local men who were working on the estate at this particular time, how many days' labour they gave and what they were paid. Now, one of the things I need to tell you is that some of the tenancies would have required labour in lieu of rent. So it was one way round the difficulties of coming up with the money to pay your rent if you just simply worked it off. That was just a normal way of doing things. It wasn't a way of getting around a problem in hard times when money was short for the tenants. This was a normal way of doing the tenancy. So it was a rent plus labour for I would say probably a lot of these guys, that's what was going on. The one man that I wanted to concentrate on is this man here. I've highlighted Francis McGuigan. Francis lived in Eden Crannan. I'm not sure where. It might have been Cotton's Corner, but I'm not 100% sure. But what's particularly interesting is this. This is a headstone in Tullyallen graveyard. And on the headstone it says, in memory of Frank McGuigan, who died December 27th, 1873, much respected and lamented by John Einer Burgess, Esquire. And this is actually the death entry from the parish records. So the stone was actually put up by John Einer Burgess. I don't know what the relationship, I mean, lots of estates and families, landed families over the centuries talked about old retainers, people that had worked for the family for one to maybe two generations. I don't know if this was the case with Frank or not, but there was obviously a very established relationship between Frank and John Einer that when Frank died, John Einer was the one that basically seems to have put up the stone. And that's in Tullyallen graveyard today. So again, it's all part of building up a picture and of an understanding what type of family relationship with the tenancy, with the land locally, and you need to be thinking about it being an established home by the mid-1800s. So this is a portrait of a very young John Einer, probably from the style of dress, the early 1820s. So he'd have been about 23 or thereabouts, 24. Now, this was his wife-to-be in another 5 years' time. I don't know for sure, but I suspect this portrait may be a recognition of this particular event. So Lady Caroline Clements attended a birthday ball in London for King George IV. And in the newspaper account of the King's birthday ball, they describe what some of the ladies and, you know, the daughters of aristocrats and whatnot were wearing. And there does seem to be some correlation between that description and what she's wearing. And you can see there's no wedding ring or anything. So again, sort of assuming from her age, Caroline would have been about 25, I think, at that particular time. So her father was Nathaniel Clements, one of the wealthiest men in Ireland, one of the beginners of the Irish banking system, and the family had land in Leitrim and Donegal. The Mohill house in County Leitrim, that was a Clements family home. Now, this is an interesting look into something of a very wealthy and aristocratic family of the early 1800s, and how really nothing's any different today, or anybody who's had daughters that are at that age and possible marriage. These are excerpts from letters that Nathaniel Clements, the Earl of Leitrim, sent to his wife about Caroline and a potential marriage. She had already singled out this young man called John Einer, and so Nathaniel's weighing up, I'm not so sure about this. So he says, a very plain man, and I should suppose above 7 or 8 and 30 years old, which was right, that's what age he was. Lady Caroline was about 29 at this stage. In short, not at all the kind of person that I should have thought any girl could have taken a fancy to. But there is no accounting for taste. So we could certainly, there's an element of snobbery going on there. It's not that, you know, you can't turn around and say that John Einer is below birth, or, you know, it's not, he's not talking about his daughter marrying someone from below stairs. We'll come to that at a later stage. In further correspondence, they will be miserably poor. Now, this is particularly good. They will be miserably poor, 400 a year with the interest of her fortune, which may be calculated at about 250 a year, is all that they will have to live upon at present. Now, that's because Nathaniel knew that Parkanaur was still a job in progress, and it could go belly up at a moment's notice and leave John Einer completely broke. It's all that they have to live on at present, which she, poor girl, says she considers an affluence, and that she does not in the least desire to have more. Oh, rebellion. So this is a daughter, very, very beautiful daughter, who really can probably pick any husband she likes within Irish aristocratic society. But oh no, she's hitched her wagon to this young, probably demonstrating a bit of wherewithal, and he's a man on the up and blah blah blah. And Daddy's thinking, this just can't happen. I can't deal with this. And finally, Caroline being of an age to judge for herself, it appeared to me that I could not do more than advise her against, which I did. Oh, that was a risk, but that I should not be justified in putting a veto upon it. Now, I don't have this experience because I have a son, but various fathers have said to me when I brought this up in conversation, yeah, wrapped around Daddy's finger, that's, around her, Daddy's wrapped around her finger. So even with all that wealth, political power, blah, 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 Caroline just probably has to say the right things and Daddy will come into line and do as he's told. So it's a wonderful, look into that sort of relationship between father and daughter. This is pictures of John Einer and Lady Caroline, obviously in midlife many years later. He was born 1798, she was born 1803. So they married in 1833 in London. He took over the estate from his father, John Henry Burgess, in 1822. Now, I want you to cast your mind back to the marriage, Margaret Burgess and Captain John Smith. Margaret was still alive. I think she made it to 80 something years of age, which was quite remarkable for that time of day. Margaret remained part of society. Her original husband, Captain John Smith, predeceased her. She remarried again, Lord Pullet, and I think she then outlived him. Margaret remained very much attached to London society. I think she lived in Chelsea or somewhere like that. And the problem was that you had this situation where John Einer was stuck between a kind of a rock and a hard place because he had loans with Margaret and she was behaving just like any bank. And it wasn't until she died in 1838 that the shackles were off John Einer and he could actually think in a bigger way what he could do with Parkanaur. He was living most of his life with his hand tied behind his back. So she died. Those debts effectively wrote off or whatever. He could invest in the Parkanaur in the way that he wanted to. So very quickly, this is just from the first Ordnance Survey of Ireland. This is a look at what Parkanaur Estate looked like on the east end of Eden Crannan in 1830. Much smaller scale than what we sort of know today. So the house and grounds. So under John Henry, there was a library extension added, and that's the library as we know it in Parkanaur today, 1822, 1823. Lady Pullet dies in 1838. And from 1839 onwards, we had the opening of the new county road. Now, the Parkanaur Street, as we know it locally today, which sits outside Parkanaur Estate, was built in 1839. So that stopped the original county road that went past the house from being the main road anymore, so that you could effectively privatize it, for want of a better word, and draw it closer into the estate. 1837 to 39, there were 28 yew trees planted around the house. So those are the yew trees we see there today. So they're just short of 200 years old. 1839 to 44, the main house structural works began. He set a contract to architect Thomas Duff, who's famous for a lot of things. Winston could probably quote every one of them or most of them. And if you want to know more about Thomas Duff, talk to Winston afterwards. But he was a very well-known and very respected architect at the time. And they wanted, whether Thomas persuaded John Einer to go down the Gothic revival route or whether John Einer had suggested, we don't know, but it was a popular design choice at the time. So that's why we have the house in the style that is today. West Terrace constructed 1843, the walled garden and gate lodge about 1851. Interesting little side note, the gate lodge was picked out of a catalogue. Would you believe there was such a thing in the 1850s when you were developing a country estate? They could just say, oh, I like that one, I'll have that one. There's actually as examples of the catalogue that the gatehouse was picked from. 1844 to 54, additional works inside and out. Over the archway into the central courtyard of Parkanaur is this plaque in the bottom there. Now, this house and offices were built by John Einer and the Lady Caroline Burgess without placing any debt upon the property. And then the date of the memorial is 1870. Now, I'll explain why that will be in a minute. So a few years back, someone had brought some photographs, or they were printed out from photographs that were taken of the interior of the house. I suspect these were taken by Lawrence's crew in 1910. So the photographs we see of the outside of Parkanaur that are from that time period, 1905, 1910, they probably asked the same cameramen to come in and take photographs of the inside of the house, but these wouldn't have been put on postcards for public consumption. These would have been part of a family's collection privately. So this would be as you would come through the front door as it is today, and then you've got that back entrance. And this, so I suspect about 1910. It's hard to know for sure. This is, I tend to call it the ballroom, the main drawing room that overlooks the deer park now today and the terrace. So that's that room, fully furnished. You can see the mirrored end to that room if you've ever been in Parkanaur in the background there. This is the library at that time. And the main sort of dining room as it was, with the wooden panelling around the side. And then there was a minstrel's gallery with an organ above. Now, in this time frame, John Einer married Lady Caroline Clements in 1833 in London, as I say. So they had 6 children. Now, tragedy struck the family between 1840, I think it was, and 1850. So part of it covered the period of the famine. But in 1840, their son Clements Keppel died at the age of 3. 5 years later, Charles Skeffington died at the age of 10. And then another 5 years later, in 1850, John Richard Alexander Wamfrey died at the age of 7. That left one male heir, which would be the future, or Einer Henry Burgess, who was the eldest child. There is no doubt that that had a very debilitating effect on them as parents. And I mean, you see this covered in the diary that John Einer kept. And I have no doubt that it probably had a great effect on Lady. I have no idea how the children died. They died young. That is not surprising in the time period that we're talking about. Infant mortality was horrendous. I mean, at levels you just couldn't begin to imagine. But this is a family that's relatively comfortable. They have a good roof over their head. They really shouldn't be wanting for food and general good health. And yet half of the family are dead within a period of just 10 years. So it just shows you that being comparatively better off than most of the people around you is by no means a protection from the ravages of life and disease and illness. We come to the year 1847, which of course is the year of the Great Famine following the potato blight of 1845. So whilst the blight occurred in 1845, it wasn't until 1847 that the full roll-on effects of repetitive failures of potato harvests and all the other things that were going wrong really hit home and began to kill people in very large numbers. So these aren't just comments that he makes in the diary about 1847. Now commences this memorable year famed for the greatest famine that ever occurred in Ireland. Our country has often and often been afflicted, but never to such an extent and suffering as now. Roads were made and never completed that led to no place. Labourers were paid who never worked, and work was done. And the reason why they never worked was they were physically incapable of working. They really should have been in a bed. Was done that was not wanted. However, the people were employed and did not starve during the winter. He's talking about his own tenantry, by the way. He's not talking generally. I never saw their minds more exasperated against the gentlemen, as if it was the landlords that brought this famine upon them, who all the time were doing their utmost to help them. Again, he's thinking very specifically within his own sphere. We all know that there were plenty of landlords who did absolutely nothing. In fact, used the opportunity to exploit things in their own way. Lady Caroline undertook her own scheme, financed it. It is recorded by the sale of her carriage horses. We know that much. My lady instituted a kitchen with every apparatus and convenience for feeding the labourers, all of whom were fed daily. They got the best beef, potatoes and pudding, which sustained them while many were starving. So they took a responsibility for their own immediate area. And they were also part of, if you like, government policies, which I'll come to in a minute. So despite these efforts, with all this, I could not keep my people, and no less than 300 went off to America, having disposed of their land to try their fortune in a strange country. That was the beginning of the end of Parkanaur as a sustainable entity. That there, 1847 was the beginning of it. To lose 300 tenants in one job lot within the space of maybe only 5 years is a body blow and probably irrecoverable. He did try to buy more land and did all sorts of things. He focused more on lumber and stuff, but that's a body blow. He was John Einer was part of the famine relief committees that were set up by the government, and they would look for donations from anybody who could donate, and I mean anybody, not just gentry, to put money together to facilitate soup kitchens. And this is the Castle Caulfield and Eton Crannon Famine Relief Committee, of which I think he was chairperson. So these are the contributions in these columns here. It's quite a mix of people. Now, most of them are people that obviously could afford to make donations. At the very top, we've got the Earl of Charlemont, £20. And you're coming on down there. You know, the Burgesses are in there. They've actually donated twice, a total of about £25 or something. Doesn't seem like an awful lot of money, but when you equate that forward, the donations for this particular relief committee would equate today to £130,000. So it certainly would facilitate feeding people through kitchens if we had to do it today. That's so the money stacks up. That's what I'm really trying to say to you. It makes sense. These are not token trifles. If you add it up, it'd be the equivalent of trying to do the same thing today and starting with a war chest of £130,000. So Parkanaur State, the Ordnance Survey map for 1857, you can see how much more developed all the planting is now maturing over a 30-year period. So they're not saplings anymore. They're some fairly mature trees. We can see the new county road, the Parkanaur Street as we know it today. That then leaves, if you like, the old county road sort of landlocked within the estate now in the lane that we know today. You see the schoolhouse. That's the first schoolhouse that was built through the finances of the Burgess family. That would have been in the I think in the late 1830s. It's long gone. And then the Parkanaur School building is still there today. That was the second school that they built at Cotton's Corner. So there was actually 2 schools built for the children of local tenants and labourers. Now, this is a fascinating insight. This is the rent ledger for 1865 for Eden Crannon. Now, what we have on the left is the name of the tenant. We then have the number of acres, I think it is. Then we have mentions of whether they had cows, pigs, etc. in the other columns. But the most interesting thing is the remarks column on the right-hand side. I should state that it's in all likelihood, these are the remarks of the land agent and probably not John Einer Burgess. I doubt if he would have, he definitely did take a serious interest, certainly in the farming on the tenancies, but it would have been the land agent who was doing any of the collecting and the general interfacing with tenants. But there's a comment here for Ben Loughran. he's a servant, so his main job, he's involved, he has a garden that he's paying some sort of nominal rent for. His wife washes for the house. So that's an indication that those two are actually employed directly in the house. One of the Gartlanys, old-fashioned, but does his best. But this is my personal favorite, and apologies if there's anybody named McHugh here tonight. This will seem like a fairly effrontery insult. I'm just trying to find the right one here if I get it. Yes, I think this is James McHugh, who had 7 acres. He's actually one of the larger plots. He's a publican. So that might explain the next comment. Slovenly. But the best bit is what's added on to that. And rich. And I started thinking, yeah, that's like a bit like the pot calling the kettle, but I don't know. But again, I think it's the land agents making the comments, but it is fascinating. But I mean, they're not, it's not like they're all, of a negative nature. Pat Quinn, very tidy, most industrious family, father, very thrifty. You can see these are the kind of things where the land agent's eyes light up. This is land that's being well looked after. It's profitable. And I don't have to worry about it. And more importantly, if he's making money, he's paying his rent. So, it's a very mixed bag, but it's a fascinating insight and a snapshot into some of those relationships and how it's as diverse as people are. You'll have people who are good farmers, bad farmers, and okay farmers. You'll have people who shouldn't be farmers at all. And there are people who are not farmers. He's a publican, so I don't know what he's doing with the 7 acres. But anyway, it's a fascinating insight. Now, John Einar Burgess died in 1889 at a ripe old age, but that had consequences because his son, Einar Henry, had to wait until he was 55, before he could take over the estate. That left him for most of his adult life at a complete loose end and constant rows with his father, who was extremely old-fashioned, extremely old-fashioned, had his own particular way of how he dealt with things. So Einar Henry just basically, I'll just leave. So he would take himself off, but he would get dragged into the schemes of the day. He got involved in the Killyleagh Linen Company, which turned out to be a bankruptcy in waiting. Luckily, he managed to get his part out of it before it all went belly up. He took more interest in the family property in East Ham in the south of England and was very successful in East Ham and made quite a name for himself. And if you go to South End or whatever it is today in that part of the world, you'll see street names. There's one of them's called Parkanaur Avenue. So because of the family's connection there, you see a lot of the things sort of doubled up. I think there might even be a Tyrone Road or something as well. But anyway, Einar Henry Burgess married into aristocracy Edith Boodle Wilbraham. And they had a family, but I say he had lots of ongoing difficulties with his father until his death in 1889. An interesting insight into, in this case, Einar Henry and politics. In 1889, there was a lot of debate going on over the building and development of a Roman Catholic university. That is literally politically correct or otherwise exactly what it says. And Mr. Balfour, who was one of the government ministers at the time, sort of thought, yeah, we need to get on with this. But of course, all the old-fashioned conservatives are thought, no, this is the end of the wage. We've done emancipation. That's far enough. No more of this. This is Einar Henry's letter to the Belfast Newsletter in support of the idea. And his final comment, it may be urged that the Roman Catholics would decline these terms. In other words, if certain members of the classes have their own way, will make it so untenable or uncomfortable, it'll never happen. But he says, to this I reply, only give them a chance. So he sort of says, no, you're creating road obstacles. So it's an interesting insight into his viewpoints on how things in Ireland were beginning to change and develop. He certainly he had a reputation for being a bit of a curmudgeon, but I think that was really a hangover in the relationship with his father, that he was probably as a young man champing at the bit to get doing things. He couldn't because daddy's still there, and that probably made him quite irascible at times. But certainly, in terms of a political outlook, you certainly wouldn't classify him as an old-fashioned conservative. Now, Edith, or Boo, as her pet name was, died in 1894. They had, I think they had about 6 or 7 of a family. Their marriage life was quite difficult. I don't know, I mean, you may, from reading at the diary, may suspect that Edith had health problems. It could have been a permanent entrenchment of postnatal depression. None of us know, but the relationship in the latter years of their marriage was quite sour. And she died in 1894, and 1893, 1894, and a few years later, Einar Henry married this lady. And I'm pretty sure that is her. That first photograph I showed you in the slides, this is us focusing in on it. This is Mary Pierce, born about 1852, 1853. Mary was the Burgess housekeeper. Now, we've all watched Downton Abbey. And what was one of the big storylines in Downton Abbey? When the youngest daughter married the chauffeur. Okay. This caused a massive scandal, but probably the worst part of it was the relationship between Einar Henry and his own children, who effectively just switched off. He didn't tell him he was doing it. He slipped away on a grand tour of Southern Europe, and he spirited Mary away quietly in the background. They had married. There wasn't anything, improper, and apart from the whole, social structures and things. He had married her in a church under license in London, but he hadn't told any of his children that he'd married her. And so many months later, he organised this trip, and unbeknownst to them, Mary was going on the trip with him. There were a few clergy, the man that had actually performed a service, and then there was the local rector here, knew about it, and a few other well-placed individuals that he felt he could trust. Unfortunately, the local rector from here was in the same place in Italy, I think it was, when he bumped into them, and he thought that the children knew. So when he came back to Tyrone, he started talking about it, and the children found out the worst possible way by local gossip. When, in terms of high society, it was a bombshell. Lady Roxburgh, who lived in Charlemont, the Caulfield family, her letter survived to this day in a book by a local historian, and she was scathing about the whole thing, that he would be shunned by society, he would not be invited anywhere, no one would visit him. And that's effectively what happened. The children I think one daughter stayed behind because, well, as might have been suggested, she possibly had to, or maybe she had a better relationship with her father than the others, but everybody basically just took themselves offside. And that left pretty much with one daughter, Mary and Einar, together in the house for quite a few years, because they married in 1896. He died 12 years later. And I know that Alfred Burgess, in writing in his sort of memoirs of the family and Burgess saga, says that his reading of the thing was that Mary and Einar Henry had a terrific relationship in marriage, very happy one. I mean, there was a fair age gap, obviously, between them, but they'd known each other for probably quite a long time. But he left provision for Mary when he died in 1908. Mary did not stay on the house. One of the saddest things of the history of Parkanaur and the family is we've no idea what happened to Mary. Not been to this day. Mary, by the way, we thought, because it recorded on their wedding certificate or license, that she was of Donaghmore, father, blacksmith or something like that. And our interpretation with a name like Pierce was Mary Irish. The other possibility was not only was she Irish, was she a Roman Catholic? But it was just purely the fact she was from below stairs, because she was actually Church of England, and she was born in Bishop's Lydiard in Somerset. So all of that original sort of chit chat that went on locally. They didn't know enough about it, I suppose, openly, but that's what we seem to know. But Mary, quietly realizing there's no relationship with the children, there's no point. She doesn't want to make things awkward for the children who will have to come to Parkanaur. She just packs her bags and leaves. Einar has left her money. He's left her a pension or whatever, so she'll never have to work again. And she was an older woman by this stage anyway, but she just disappears off the map. I haven't been able to find anything about her, which is very sad. This is a picture from probably around the same set of photographs, about 1910, of the household staff. So, and that would tie up with the 1911 census. So the lady on the right, second one up, is probably the cook, and the rest of these would be various forms of housemaids. The junior maid would probably be the one just above the cook. And this man in the middle, not sure, but he's either chauffeur, footman, whatever, that sort of thing. I haven't been able to tie all the names up because I can't be too sure of the date of the photograph. So Einar Henry's son, Einar Richard Patrick Burgess, had married Frederica Gillett. The Gillett family were bankers from Banbury in Oxfordshire. And sadly, Einar Richard Patrick, the family were living in, he's one of the children I'd mentioned about that was sort of estranged from their father. He died in Llanrynny in Pembrokeshire in Wales in 1905. He predeceased his father by 3 years. So the heir, if you like, when Einar Henry dies in 1908, is a very young child. The future, well, he was Alfred, Einar Alfred Burgess, but he was still a child. So for quite a while, they were living in Wales and remained there for quite a while. The Parkanaur was maintained more or less by, senior servants and, land agents or whatever. And until it was, the right time for Alfred to take over the family estate. And this is a picture of Einar Alfred and his wife, Christine O'Shea. Christine's people were from Waterford, County Waterford. So he inherits the estate at the age of 8, but obviously he can't do anything with it. So it has to sort of sit in abeyance until he's old enough to take over. He had a career in the army and major, I think, on retirement. And this is the last members of the family living at Parkanaur now. So Einar Alfred and his wife Christine would take Parkanaur through to the finish in the 1950s. So joining us tonight via Zoom is Simon Porter and Patsy. And Patsy, could be corrected on this, she was probably the last Burgess born in Parkanaur. So I said to you about back in 1847, the 300 tenants that left. That was the beginning of the end of, if you like, the long-term viability of Parkanaur as an estate. The next whammy to hit them was the Irish Land Reform Acts. Unique to Ireland, did not take place in Scotland, England, or Wales. There's nothing in comparison. It's unique to Ireland and the British Isles in that sense. But in that, the land is sold to sitting tenants with long-term cheap loans, some of which were still being paid in the 1970s, were being paid back. So he's losing the land, he's losing the tenants from, the family is from about 1870s, 80s onwards. This progression really doesn't start hitting home until the early 1900s. So it's going to get to a point where, unless there's some other form of income coming around, Parkanaur can no longer work as it was historically created. And it was really during Alfred's tenure that this was all sort of developing. He obviously had had a paid career in the army and stuff like that, which would have been vital. There's other things there was a farm aspect and other projects were undertaken, but the old style reason of how Parkanaur functioned couldn't be sustained anymore. The decision was taken by the family to move to England and close Parkanaur and sell the estate. And The contents of the house were auctioned off in October 1955. And this is a picture of the catalogue from John Ross and Company. And you can see the sale at Parkanaur realised more than £8,000. That's an awful lot of money in 1955. About 800 people attended at the last day of the sale yesterday when 400 lots were auctioned. There's everything in there: paintings, antique furniture, china, all that sort of stuff. That most of the valuable stuff, but everything right down to bed linen. If anything had a value, there was no point in retaining it. Certainly no point in dragging it all the way to England. So there was everything was in it. One of the remarkable things about the auction, it obviously is a very sad reflection, because it's the end of a family's nearly, not quite about 100 and not quite 200 years anyway in that, but so many of those objects ended up in the family homes that are around Parkanaur, and some of them are still there to this very day. Some of them have come back to Parkanaur as donations, which is quite interesting. And if any of you live in locally, the little exhibit that they had in the yard at the back of Parkanaur upstairs that my mother-in-law used to watch over at weekends, had a lot of the old sort of utility china and other apparatus that was used in the house at the time. So Parkanaur itself was sold in February 1956. And this is the advert again by John Ross and Company. Magnificent stone-built mansion house, revival Gothic, in excellent order and attractive surroundings. The main grounds and gardens with one autocast and 2 grass tennis courts, ample out offices and buildings, gate lodge, etc., etc. Property which is freehold would be ideally suitable for a school, institution, hospital. Now, the reason why they're saying that is by this stage, it is the end of the sort of that landed gentry aristocratic period. The most likely tenants are not going to be other families of that type. This is part of that whole rolling societal change. So we see a lot of these houses, they become offices, they become convents, they become schools. This is typical. I mean, the convent at Donaghmore is based on the property of the Mackenzies, and before that, the Walkers. So, this is typical of this ongoing sort of progression of how things change. So we meet these two gentlemen. Thomas Doran was the son of a tenant farmer in Gordleanahan back at the turn of the 1900s, born in 1907. He went to America in 1919 with, literally, as the old saying goes, the shirt on his back. He really hadn't much more. Family were not well-off farmers, even close to that. They were just pretty much like many at the time, just getting by. But he was employed in a bakery in New York for a period of years, took ill, probably rheumatic fever. And while he was bedridden, had to consider what he was going to be able to do in the future, which would not be heavy manual labor. He wouldn't be fit for it. And he decided to sell greetings cards. There was a woman went round the ward selling greetings cards. I can do that. Actually, anybody could do that. And that then became the Cheerful Greetings Card Company by the 1960s. And when Thomas retired from the company that he founded, which took over the bakery that he'd worked in as a driver at one point, in the 1966, I think it was, he was worth $13 million, I think it was. Not bad for a lad that left Gordleanahan in 1919. So anyway, he came back to Ireland regularly in the 1950s while he was still quite healthy, and really making up with old friends, neighbours, blah, blah, blah. At the time, the Reverend Akins was the minister of Castle Caulfield Presbyterian Church, and him and his wife Mary had a son, Stanley, who had cerebral palsy. And as a young man, I think Stanley was born in the 1940s, it literally could be life or death as to whether Stanley would survive, but certainly as a baby with that illness at that particular time, or that condition. But Stanley did survive, but they realized that it took a lot of intensive therapies, which they managed to find people to help them with. But it left Jerry and his wife, Mary, very focused on this terrible chasm in society at the time with regard to what were becoming then adults with severe disabilities, and how they were effectively just locked away, out of sight, out of mind. And this needed to change. And they wanted Stanley to have a life. And they pulled out every imaginable stop to make that possible. But he befriended Thomas on one of the trips, and they took a walk round Parkanaur, which was empty at the time. And the discussion took place, Jerry Akins records it in his book, that after sort of gushing gleefully about this, and then sort of a very depressed mood, that this would be an ideal place to set up as a centre for people, you know, with cerebral palsy and conditions like that, to train them for life, give them job skills, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, but he sort of, where am I ever, you know, as a Presbyterian minister, where am I ever going to pull the money together to do that? I'm just talking. To which Tom turned round, pulled out a set of keys from his pocket and says, well, there you are. I was with the solicitor in Belfast this morning. I've bought it. And he literally handed Jerry the keys. He says, what are you waiting for? Get cracking. Tom had actually left and expressed desire that he didn't want his name to be associated with it. He didn't, it wasn't some sort of a step of personal grandeur. He was an extremely wealthy man. The £13,000 that he'd spent, and I don't know how many acres with the house with that. And interestingly, nearly the same value in 1771 of the 6,000 was nothing to Tom in terms, you know, it was barely a scratch out of his personal wealth. But he was obviously so enthused and knew of the difficulties that Jerry and Mary had had. So that was the beginning of what would become Parkanaur College. So this is a wee painting that was done of Mary, Jerry and Stanley, probably in his late 30s or early 40s, maybe, when that was painted. So today it's the Thomas Doran Parkanaur Trust, Parkanaur College and Residential Care Home. That's a snapshot from the website. So the college opened in 1960. Now, not just obviously the grand act of Tom burying the house to start with, but it was a house that had a heating system that really wasn't up to the standards of the 1960s, or what the government would consider it was an old-fashioned basement coke boiler system. So there was much modernisation. It had to be adapted for a number of students coming in to live there residentially and stuff. So a lot of this was done with volunteers and local charities. And if you're in the long gallery, as it's called today, you'll see that there are little plaques on the wall from, you know, round tables and Lions clubs and whatever, who all contributed to it. The local constables used to come up and help out at the painting. Literally up, uniform, tunic off, paintbrush out. That's done that bit. I'll be back on Thursday or whatever. It was everybody got involved in it, which was a lovely thing. So this is a picture of Parkanaur Forest, or from the diagram thing, was signed like this. So the forest was developed out of a purchase of sort of, if you like, the surplus land around Parkanaur, I think in the 1970s or 80s. And the Forestry Service of the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development then created Parkanaur Forest, and they still manage it today. And the white fallow deer herd was brought there in 1976 after the purchase of the 78. And they come from a herd in Mallow in County Cork that originally was planted as a present from Queen Elizabeth I to her goddaughter in, well, prior to 1603. And that's an aerial view then of Parkanaur as we know it today, probably a few years ago. And it's amazing how much that planting is recognizable to the old maps. You know exactly where you are, sort of thing. So folks, that's it.